Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm unfortunately not going to be live streaming, but I'm still going to make a video for you, and you can watch as you are now, at 4 o'clock, the regular time. So also wanted to remind you that tomorrow I'm not going to be reading, but Monday I'll be back to live streaming at 4. So last time we left off, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. We left off with Charlie finally finding a golden ticket, and he just opened it and in the store, and now he's on his way home to tell his family that he got the golden ticket. So let's see what happens now. Chapter 12. What it said on the golden ticket. Charlie burst through the front door shouting, "Mother, mother!" Mrs. Bucket was in the old grandparents' room serving them their evening soup. "Mother!" yelled Charlie, rushing in on them like a hurricane. "Look, I've got it! Look, Mother, look! The last golden ticket, it's mine! I found some money in the street, and I bought 2 candy bars, and the second one had the golden ticket, and there were crowds of people all around me wanting to see it, and the shopkeeper rescued me, and I ran all the way home, and here I am. It's the 5th golden ticket, Mother, and I've found it." Mrs. Bucket simply stood and stared, while the 4 old grandparents, who were sitting up in bed, balancing bowls of soup on their laps, all dropped their spoons with a clatter and froze against their pillows. For about 10 seconds, there was absolute silence in the room. Nobody dared to speak or move. It was a magical moment. Then very softly, Grandpa Joe said, "You're pulling our legs, Charlie, aren't you? You're having a little joke." "I'm not," cried Charlie, rushing up to the bed and holding out the large and beautiful golden ticket for him to see. Grandpa Joe leaned forward and took a close look, his nose almost touching the ticket. The others watched him, waiting for the verdict. Then very slowly, with a slow and marvelous grin spreading all over his face, Grandpa Joe lifted his head and looked straight at Charlie. The color was rushing to his cheeks, and his eyes were wide open, shining with joy, and in the center of each eye, right in the very center, in the black pupil, a little spark of wild excitement was slowly dancing. Then the old man took a deep breath, and suddenly, with no warning whatsoever, an explosion seemed to take place inside him. He threw up his arms and yelled, "Yippee!" And at the same time, his long, bony body rose up out of the bed, and his bowl of soup went flying into the face of Grandma Josephine, and in one fantastic leap, this old fellow of 96 and a half, who hadn't been out of bed these last 20 years, jumped onto the floor and started doing a dance of victory in his pajamas. "Yippee!" he shouted. Three cheers for Charlie! Hip, hip, hooray!" At this point, the door opened and Mr. Bucket walked into the room. He was cold and tired, and he looked it. All day long he had been shoveling snow in the streets. "Cripes!" he cried. "What's going on in here?" It didn't take them long to tell him what had happened. "I don't believe it," he said. "It's not possible." "Show him the ticket, Charlie," shouted Grandpa Joe, who was still dancing around the floor like a dervish in his striped pajamas. "Show your father the 5th and last golden ticket in the world." "Let me see it, Charlie," Mr. Bucket said, collapsing into a chair and holding out his hand. Charlie came forward with the precious document. It was a very beautiful thing, this golden ticket, having been made, so it seemed, from a sheet of pure gold, hammered out almost to the thinness of paper. On one side of it, printed by some clever method in jet black letters, was the invitation itself, from Mr. Wonka. "Read it out loud," said Grandpa Joe, climbing back into bed again at last. Let's all hear exactly what it says." Mr. Bucket held the lovely golden ticket up close to his eyes. His hands were trembling slightly, and he seemed to be overcome by the whole business. He took several deep breaths, then he cleared his throat and said, "All right, I'll read it. Here we go. Greetings to you, the lucky finder of this golden ticket from Mr. Willy Wonka. I shake you warmly by the hand. Tremendous things are in store for you. Many wonderful surprises await you. For now, I do invite you to come to my factory and be my guest for one whole day, you and all others who are lucky enough to find my golden tickets. I, Mr. Willy Wonka, will conduct you around the factory myself, showing you everything that there is to see, and afterwards, when it is time to leave, you will be escorted home by a procession of large trucks. These trucks, I can promise you, will be loaded with enough delicious edibles to last you and your entire household for many years. If at any time thereafter you should run out of supplies, you have only to come back to the factory and show this golden ticket, and I shall be happy to refill your cupboard with whatever you may want. In this way, you will be able to keep yourself supplied with tasty morsels for the rest of your life. But this is by no means the most exciting thing that will happen on the day of your visit. I am preparing other surprises that are even more marvelous and more fantastic for you and for all my beloved golden ticket holders. Mystic and marvelous surprises that will entrance, delight, intrigue, astonish, and perplex you beyond measure. In your wildest dreams, you could not imagine that such things could happen to you. Just wait and see. And now, here are your instructions. The day I have chosen for the visit is the first day in the month of February. On this day, and on no other, you must come to the factory gates at 10 o'clock sharp in the morning. Don't be late. And you are allowed to bring with you either one or two members of your own family to look after you and to ensure that you don't get into mischief. One more thing. Be certain to have this ticket with you, otherwise you will not be admitted. Willy Wonka. The first day of February, cried Mrs. Bucket. But that's tomorrow. Today is the last day of January. I know it is. Cripes, said Mr. Bucket. I think you're right. You're just in time, shouted Grandpa Joe. There's not a moment to lose. You must start making preparations at once. Wash your face, comb your hair, scrub your hands, brush your teeth, blow your nose, cut your nails, polish your shoes, iron your shirt, and for heaven's sake, get all that mud off your pants. You must get ready, my boy. You must get ready for the biggest day of your life. Now, don't overexcite yourself, Grandpa, Mrs. Bucket said, and don't fluster poor Charlie. We must all try to keep very calm. Now, the first thing to decide is this. Who is going with Charlie to the factory? I will, shouted Grandpa Joe, leaping out of bed once again. I'll take him. I'll look after him. You leave it to me. Mrs. Bucket smiled at the old man. Then she turned to her husband and said, How about you, dear? Don't you think you ought to go? Well, Mr. Bucket said, pausing to think about it. No, I'm not so sure that I should go. But you must. There's no must about it, my dear, Mr. Bucket said gently. Mind you, I'd love to go. It'll be tremendously exciting. But on the other hand, I believe that the person who really deserves to go most of all is Grandpa Joe himself. He seems to know more about it than we do, provided, of course, that he feels well enough. Yippee! Shouted Grandpa Joe, seizing Charlie by the hands and dancing round the room. He certainly seems well enough, Mrs. Bucket said, laughing. Yes, perhaps you're right, after all. Perhaps Grandpa Joe should be the one to go with him. I certainly can't go myself and leave the other 3 old people all alone in bed for a whole day. Hallelujah! Yelled Grandpa Joe. Praise the Lord. At that moment, there came a loud knock on the front door. Mr. Bucket went to open it, and the next moment swarms of newspapermen and photographers were pouring into the house. They had tracked down the finder of the 5th golden ticket, and now they all wanted to get the full story for the front pages of the morning papers. For several hours, there was complete pandemonium in the little house, and it must have been nearly midnight before Mr. Bucket was able to get rid of them so that Charlie could go to bed. Chapter 13. The big day arrives. The sun was shining brightly on the morning of the big day, but the ground was still white with snow, and the air was very cold. Outside the gates of Wonka's factory, enormous crowds of people had gathered to watch the 5 lucky ticket holders going in. The excitement was tremendous. It was just before 10 o'clock. The crowds were pushing and shouting, and policemen with arms linked were trying to hold them back from the gates. Right beside the gates, in a small group that was carefully shielded from the crowds by the police, stood 5 famous children, together with the grown-ups who had come with them. The tall, bony figure of Grandpa Joe could be seen standing quietly among them, and besides him, holding tightly onto his hand, was little Charlie Bucket himself. All the children except Charlie had both their mothers and fathers with them, and it was a good thing that they had, otherwise the whole party might have gone out of hand. They were so eager to get going that their parents were having to hold them back by force to prevent them from climbing over the gates. "Be patient," cried the fathers. "Be still. It's not time yet. It's not 10 o'clock. Behind him, Charlie Bucket could hear the shouts of the people in the crowd as they pushed and fought to get a glimpse of the famous children. "There's Violet Burgard," he heard someone shouting. "That's her, all right. I can remember her face from the newspapers." "And you know what?" someone else shouted. "She's still chewing that dreadful old piece of gum she's had for 3 months. You look at her jaws, they're still working on it." "Who's the big fat boy?" "That's Augustus Gloop." "So it is. Enormous, isn't he?" "Fantastic." "Who's the kid with the picture of the Lone Ranger stenciled on his windbreaker?" "That's Mike TV. He's the television fiend." "He must be crazy. Look at all those crazy pistols he's got hanging all over him." "The one I want to see is Veruca Salt," shouted another voice in the crowd. "She's the girl whose father bought up over 500,000 candy bars and then made the workers of his peanut factory unwrap every one of them until they found a golden ticket. He gives her anything she wants. Absolutely anything. She only has to start screaming for it and she gets it. Dreadful, isn't it? Shocking, I call it." "Which do you think is her?" "That one. Over to the left. The little girl in the silver mink coat." "Which one is Charlie Bucket?" "Charlie Bucket? He must be that skinny little shrimp standing beside the old fellow who looks like a skeleton. Right close to us, just there, see him? Why hasn't he got a coat on in this cold weather? Don't ask me. Maybe he can't afford to buy one. Jeepers, he must be freezing." Charlie, standing only a few paces away from the speaker, gave Grandpa Joe's hand a squeeze, and the old man looked down at Charlie and smiled. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock began striking 10. Very slowly, with a loud creaking of rusty hinges, the great iron gates of the factory began to swing open. The crowd became suddenly silent. The children stopped jumping about. All eyes were fixed upon the gates. "There he is," someone shouted. "That's him." And so it was. Chapter 14. Mr. Willy Wonka. Mr. Wonka was standing all alone just inside the open gates of the factory. And what an extraordinary little man he was! He had a black top hat on his head. He wore a tailcoat made of a beautiful plum-colored velvet. His trousers were bottle green, his gloves were pearly gray, and in one hand he carried a fine gold-topped walking cane. Covering his chin, there was a small, neat, pointed black beard, a goatee, and his eyes were the most marvelously bright. They seemed to be sparkling and twinkling at you all the time. The whole face, in fact, was alight with fun and laughter. And oh, how clever he looked, how quick and sharp and full of life. He kept making quick, jerky movements with his head, cocking it this way and that, and taking everything in with those bright, twinkling eyes. He was like a squirrel in the quickness of his movements, like a quick, clever, old squirrel from the park. Suddenly he did a funny little skipping dance in the snow, and he spread his arms wide, and he smiled at the 5 children who were clustered near the gates, and he called out, "Welcome, my friends! Welcome to the factory." His voice was high and fluty. "Will you come forward one at a time, please?" he called out, "and bring your parents. Then show me your golden ticket and give me your name." "Who's first?" The big fat boy stepped up. "I'm Augustus Gloop," he said. "Augustus," cried Mr. Wonka, seizing his hand and pumping it up and down with terrific force. "My dear boy, how good to see you. Delighted, charmed, overjoyed to have you with us. And these are your parents? How nice. Come in, come in. That's right. Step through the gates." Mr. Wonka was clearly just as excited as everyone else. "My name," said the next child to go forward, "is Veruca Salt. Dear Veruca, how do you do? What a pleasure this is. You do have an interesting name, don't you? I always thought that a verruca was a sort of wart that you got on the sole of your foot. But I must be wrong, mustn't I? Oh, how pretty you look in that lovely mink coat. I'm so glad you could come. Dear me, this is going to be such an exciting day. I do hope you enjoyed. I'm sure you will. I know you will. Your father? How are you, Mr. Salt? And Mrs. Salt? Overjoyed to see you. Yes, the ticket is quite in order. Please go in." The next 2 children, Violet Burgard and Mike TV, came forward to have their tickets examined, and then to have their arms practically pumped off their shoulders by the energetic Mr. Wonka. And last of all, a small, nervous voice whispered, "Charlie Bucket." "Charlie," cried Mr. Wonka. "Well, well, well, so there you are. You're the one who found your ticket only yesterday, aren't you?" "Yes, yes, I read all about it in the morning's papers." "Just in time, my dear boy. I'm so glad, so happy for you. And this your grandfather?" "Delighted to meet you, sir. Overjoyed, enraptured, enchanted." "All right, excellent. Is everybody in now? 5 children? Yes, good. Now will you please follow me? Our tour is about to begin. But do keep together. Please don't wander off by yourselves. I shouldn't like to lose any of you at this stage of the proceedings." "Oh, dear me, no." Charlie glanced back over his shoulder and saw the great iron entrance gates closing slowly behind him. The crowds on the outside were still pushing and shouting. Charlie took a last look at them, and as the gates closed with a clang, all sight of the outside world disappeared. "Here we are," cried Mr. Wonka, trotting along in front of the group. "Through this big red door, please. That's right. It's nice and warm inside. I have to keep it warm inside of the factory because of the workers. My workers are used to an extremely hot climate. They can't stand the cold. They'd perish if they went outdoors in this weather. They'd freeze to death." "But who are these workers?" asked Augustus Gloop. "All in good time, my dear boy," said Mr. Wonka, smiling at Augustus. "Be patient. You shall see everything as we go along. Are all of you inside? Good. Would you mind closing the door? Thank you. Charlie Bucket found himself standing in a long corridor that stretched away in front of him as far as he could see. The corridor was so wide that a car could easily have driven all along it. The walls were pale pink, the lighting was soft and pleasant. How lovely and warm, whispered Charlie. I know, what a marvelous smell, answered Grandpa Joe, taking a long, deep sniff. All the most wonderful smells in the world seemed to be mixing up in the air around them. The smell of roasting coffee, and burnt sugar, and melting chocolate, and mint, and violets, and crushed hazelnuts, and apple blossom, and caramel, and lemon peel, and far off in the distance, from the heart of the great factory, came a muffling roar of energy, as though some monstrous, gigantic machine were spinning its wheels at breakneck speed. Now this, my dear children, said Mr. Wonka, raising his voice above the noise, this is the main corridor. Will you please hang your coats and hats on those pegs over there? Then follow me. That's the way. Good. Everyone ready? Come on then, here we go. He trotted off rapidly down the corridor with the tails of his plum-colored velvet coat flapping behind him, and the visitors all hurried after him. It was quite a large party of people, when you came to think of it. There were 9 grown-ups and 5 children, 14 in all, so you can imagine that there was a good deal of pushing and shoving as they hustled and bustled down the passage, trying to keep up with the swift little figure in front of them. Come on, cried Mr. Wonka. Get a move on, please. We'll never get round today if you dawdle like this. Soon he turned right off the main corridor and into another slightly narrower passage. He turned left, then left again, then right, then left, then right, then right, then left. The place was a gigantic rabbit warren, with passages leading this way and that in every direction. Don't you let go of my hand, Charlie, whispered Grandpa Joe. Notice how all these passages are sloping downwards, called Mr. Wonka. We are now going underground. All the most important rooms in my factory are deep down below the surface. Why is that? Somebody asked. There wouldn't be nearly enough space for them up top, answered Mr. Wonka. These rooms we're going to see are enormous. They're larger than football fields. No building in the world would be big enough to house them. But down here underneath the ground, I've got all the space I want. There's no limit, so long as I hollow it out. Mr. Wonka turned right. He turned left. He turned right again. The passages were sloping steeper and steeper downhill now. Then suddenly Mr. Wonka stopped. In front of him there was a shiny metal door. The party crowded round. On the door, in large letters, it said, The Chocolate Room. Chapter 15. The Chocolate Room. An important room, this, cried Mr. Wonka, taking a bunch of keys from his pocket and slipping one into the keyhole of the door. This is the nerve center of the whole factory, the heart of the whole business. It's so beautiful. I insist upon my rooms being beautiful. I can't abide ugliness in factories. In we go, then. But do be careful, my dear children. Don't lose your heads. Don't get overexcited. Keep very calm. Mr. Wonka opened the door. 5 children and 9 grown-ups pushed their way in. And oh, what an amazing sight it was, now that met their eyes. They were looking down upon a lovely valley. There were green meadows on either side of the valley, and along the bottom of it there flowed a great brown river. What is more, there was a tremendous waterfall halfway along the river. A steep cliff over which the water curled and rolled in a solid sheet, and then went crashing down into a boiling, churning whirlpool of froth and spray. Below the waterfall, and this was the most astonishing sight of all, a whole mass of enormous glass pipes were dangling down into the river from somewhere high up in the ceiling. They really were enormous, those pipes. There must have been a dozen of them at least, and they were sucking up brownish, muddy water from the river and carrying it away to goodness knows where. And because they were made of glass, you could see the liquid flowing and bubbling along inside them. And above the noise of the waterfall, you could hear the never-ending sucking sound of the pipes as they did their work. Graceful trees and bushes were growing along the riverbanks, weeping willows and alders and tall clumps of rhododendrons with their pink and red and mauve blossoms. In the meadows there were thousands of buttercups. "There!" cried Mr. Wonka, dancing up and down and pointing his gold-topped cane at the great brown river. "It's all chocolate. Every drop of that river is hot melted chocolate of the finest quality. The very finest quality. There's enough chocolate in there to fill every bathtub in the entire country, and all the swimming pools as well. Isn't it terrific? And just look at my pipes. They suck up the chocolate and carry it away to all the other rooms in the factory where it is needed. Thousands of gallons an hour, my dear children. Thousands and thousands of gallons." The children and their parents were too flabbergasted to speak. They were staggered. They were dumbfounded. They were bewildered and dazzled. They were completely bowled over by the hugeness of the whole thing. They simply stood and stared. "The waterfall is most important," Mr. Wonka went on. "It mixes the chocolate. It churns it up. It pounds it and beats it. It makes it light and frothy. No other factory in the world mixes its chocolate by waterfall. But it's the only proper way to do it. The only way. And do you like my trees?" he cried, pointing with his stick. "And my lovely bushes? Don't you think they look pretty? I told you I hate ugliness. And of course, they are all edible. All made of something different and delicious. And do you like my meadows? Do you like my grass and my buttercups? The grass you are standing on, my dear ones, is made of a new kind of soft minty sugar that I've just invented. It's called sludge. Try a blade. Please do, it's delectable." Automatically, everybody bent down and picked one blade of grass. Everyone, that is, except Augustus Gloop, who took a big handful. And Violet Burgard, before tasting her blade of grass, took the piece of world record-breaking chewing gum out of her mouth and stuck it carefully behind her ear. "Isn't it wonderful?" whispered Charlie. "Hasn't it got a wonderful taste, Grandpa?" "Could eat the whole field," said Grandpa Joe, grinning with delight. "I could go around on all fours like a cow and eat every blade of grass in the field." "Try a buttercup," cried Mr. Wonka. "They're even nicer." Suddenly the air was filled with screams of excitement. The screams came from Veruca Salt. She was pointing frantically to the other side of the river. "Look! Look over there!" she screamed. "What is it? He's moving, he's walking. It's a little person, a little man, down there below the waterfall." Everybody stopped picking buttercups and stared across the river. "She's right, Grandpa," cried Charlie. "It is a little man. Can you see him?" "I see him, Charlie," said Grandpa Joe excitedly. And now everybody was shouting at once. "There's two of them." "My gosh, so there is. There's more than two. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What are they doing? Where do they come from? Who are they?" Children and parents alike rushed down to the edge of the river to get a little closer look. "Aren't they fantastic? No higher than my knee. Look at their funny long hair." The tiny men were no larger than medium-sized dolls. had stopped what they were doing, and now they were staring back across the river at the visitors. One of them pointed toward the children, and then he whispered something to the other four, and all five of them burst into peals of laughter. "But they can't be real people," Charlie said. "Of course they're real people," Mr. Wonka answered. "They're Oompa Loompas." But what happens next? We will find out tomorrow. Thanks for joining me again to listen to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And next time we're going to read about the Oompa Loompas and all the other wonderful rooms and places in Wonka's Chocolate Factory. So again, sorry that I couldn't live stream today. And a reminder that tomorrow I will not be live streaming. I take a break every Sunday. But starting Monday, we're going to pick up about the Oompa Loompas at 4 o'clock. I'm going to be live streaming on Monday. So I hope you can join me then. And have a wonderful day.